Word. And with the chapter, who is starting?
I'm going to start.
Okay, so you're going to load it up?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, looks good. Perfect.
Oh, let's get it on the right screen. Okay. So with the present mode, can you see the whole screen or is it too big?
I think it has worked for the last couple times. Every now and then it decides to be wacko and be too big. But if you want to try and do it that way, it's fine. If you want to leave it like this, I think it's fine as well.
Okay. We'll try it like this. And if there's any complaints, then.
And if one of you wants to drop the link into the chat for people to follow along that way, if it doesn't fit on their screen, that's fine. Or I can look it up too if you want.
I can, in just a second, I can throw it in the link.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. People found that pretty helpful last week, I think. All right, so then you folks can all can go ahead and take this away, and I'll stop talking.
So the chapter similarities and differences, and in the chapter it talks about why we should be doing this, and it talks about how we can use this to make sense of the world, and can help students move from what they already know to adding more information, so it allows them to build onto things, along with also moving from concrete ideas into abstract ideas. And then there's also the idea it can connect things together, help them draw inferences, see patterns, refine and define schemas. So there's a lot of ways that this helps the students. In the book, it talked about the results being a 25% gain or effect size of 0.66. And they talked about the details and the testing, and I'll let you read that because that's probably not as fun to go through here. But there are 4 strategies, and Melissa coming up is going to talk a little bit more in each of the detail, which is comparing, classifying, metaphors, and analogies. So we talked earlier about how we can move from existing knowledge to adding new knowledge. Another term for that is activating that prior knowledge, and that was talked a little bit before, but sometimes we can activate that prior knowledge, but we don't tie it to new knowledge. And so the book talked about how learning can be lost if we don't take that time to tie it with something. And so this is a strategy or a technique that they used. Now I teach high school science, so these are like my bread and butter. I mean, I do this all the time, classifying, comparing, and even building metaphors. I'm constantly, like when I was teaching biology and we were talking about the parts of the cell, which can get pretty complicated. You know, I could sit there and say, oh, but this is like your FedEx. He's your package and delivery person. And that building that metaphor really helps them tie what they already know to new information. So it's something I really like. I think it's probably harder, maybe from my perspective, to use every day in maybe math. I was trying to think of different ways you could use it. And I fear, I think I'd have more of a problem with math doing this, but I can see how it can be done in English and history. And I know analogies, up until I was reading the chapter, I kind of left that, and that's something they test us on. Do you guys remember taking tests where you had to do those analogies, which I always hated? But I never thought to try to use that in the classroom. But I know that the metaphors is a fun and easy one, and classifying and comparing words for science. And Melissa's going to talk about the details of that in just a little bit. I'm going to talk before that on how we can use it in the classroom. The key word, I think, for classroom practices is to teach. It's not something that a lot of kids are just going to get. We're going to have to model it and show explicitly how to do things in a variety of ways. Because our goal is, to help them learn how to learn. That's really, I think, a teacher's job is to help kids learn how to learn, not just, dump information on them. So we're looking at providing those tools to help them categorize and organize it and be able to retrieve it better. And to do that, we just need to show them how to do that and guide them through those steps. And I think this chapter especially ties back to all the other chapters, which is why I had them listed up here. It's just like, yeah, we're kind of like already talked about some of these when we talked about non-linguistic representations and advanced organizers and using cues and questions and providing feedback. I think we're starting to see that we're using all of them to do this technique. So I'll turn over to Melissa, and she'll cover the 4 strategies and specifics to see how they work.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
And then do you want me to stop sharing so that you can share, or do you want me to just change the screen?
Can you just keep doing
Okay.
it? Yeah, thank you. All right. So going on to the next slide. Does that work, or do I have to do it? Can you go on to the next slide?
Did you change the slide, Michelle?
I did. Hold on, let me.
Okay, it's still showing us classroom practices on here.
Yep, I'm going to stop sharing and then share again.
Yeah, sometimes it gets a little glitchy.
Is it now showing the strategies?
Yeah, we can start at this one. That's fine. The previous slide just listed the 4. So we're going to talk about comparing, classifying, metaphors, and analogies. This one's about comparing. So this is where students are identifying similarities between 2 things or ideas. So when students are doing this, they need to select the items that they're going to compare and then identify the characteristics between each that they're going to talk about. Contrasting is another word that we hear frequently. Sorry. Oops. So with comparing, contrasting is also another word that we hear often when we talk about comparing, but that just means talking about, it refers to identifying the differences, but comparing can cover both of those. So most of the time we just hear comparing, but for examples and ways to use this in the classroom is, the book talked a lot about comparing different sets of notes. And actually the graph that I used at the bottom there was from the text and talking about how, you take notes from this text and take notes from this text, and then you can pull it together and pull out what was the same and different between both of those. It's actually made me think about like the summarizing thing, which is the lesson that we did last week, but it made me connect to that. So that's kind of like what you said about how these chapters are all kind of coming together now, but and then using a Venn diagram is another way we see comparing frequently. Can you go to the next one for me? Classifying. So this is organizing them just based on the similarities, organizing items based on similarities. So students need to think about first the items, and then what do they have the same attributes. They have to, or think about attributes that they have, and then think about something else that has those same attributes, and then form categories based on that. So when I was reading this chapter, I noticed that myself, I teach 5th grade. It's a little different than high school, but for my students, would scaffold this a little more. Like maybe I would give them the categories and then see if they could fill in the rest of it. And then we'd go from there, because this would be something difficult to just throw at a group of 4th or 5th graders. But but I think it would work better if I scaffolded it a little bit for them. And then this can have as many categories as needed, so this process would just be repeated until then. Some of the examples that I read about was like different themes could be the categories, and then you could place movies, books, plays, shows, anything in those categories that have that same theme, or classifying animals based on their characteristics. I know one that I do every year is like in math when we do geometry and shapes, and we're classifying shapes based on their characteristics. So this is definitely one that can be used across many subjects. Okay, metaphors. I'm just grabbing my notes. So teachers can use metaphors to help students make connections. I thought that the example that was used in the book about internet, how when the internet first came out and people were struggling with how it worked and things like that, and then they connected it to, I think it was called like a super highway or something, and then that made more sense to everyone else that was struggling with this idea that, you know, things are floating around out there and we can look them up. So when they made that metaphor, people understood it a little bit better, and I think that's so true in the classroom as well, that when you make connections that way, that sometimes kids will pick up on it and it'll make more sense to them. This is another one, though, that I think it's difficult for at least my group of students to come up with a metaphor on their own. So what I've done in my class is give them a metaphor or point out a metaphor that I see in a book, and then we discuss what it means. And that's kind of what the book talked about, too, was that I think it used the example of the rainbow, the garden is a rainbow or something, and how, okay, well, the garden's not in the sky, so what does this mean? And then you just have a discussion from there. But when I talk poetry and even like your narrative writing, we still talk about this type of figurative language, and the kids really do enjoy learning about it, but it's just another one that needs to be scaffolded a little bit, and you need to understand why you're writing these metaphors and what they mean. So that's the biggest thing I think I pulled out as well. All right, analogies. So analogies can be used to help students see the similarities between things that seem different. So, and I do remember seeing this on tests and things like that and thinking I didn't really understand it, but so the format is A is to B is, C is to D, and you're trying to find relationships to things. This one, it said in the book, can be most difficult for students to understand just because they're trying to think of two things, determine that relationship between those two things, and then they need to think of two other things that have that same relationship. So it's very abstract, you know, to explain to students and for them to try to come up with one on their own. I like the idea of starting with something simple like hot is to cold as day is to night. So thinking about opposites and things like that. But this would be another one that I would definitely go slow with my group of students and scaffold and give them ones first and then go from there. I found this graphic organizer that I put on there and I really liked that because it kind of explained it. I would use it at the elementary level, but like putting the words in there, stating the relationship, and then figuring out another pair that has that relationship. And I like how they put that in the middle, so I put that on here. But I thought it was a good visual that I would use at the elementary level. Yes, I think that is all I have for mine. Thank you.
All right, and then I'm the third one. Thanks, Melissa and Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of scaffolding, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to guide students through these tasks. And so the text states that it's important to explicitly teach about how to use these and talking about similarities and differences as you're teaching. And they kind of scaffold, like within the text, how you can help students scaffold this work for students. So starting with explicit instructions. Can everyone still hear me? Okay, I just want to make sure. Then you do teacher structured tasks. So the teacher is providing the elements and the categories for like comparison and classification strategies, or providing the first metaphor and relationship for metaphors, or maybe presenting the full analogy, like night is to day as hot is to cold, and then asking students to identify the relationship. Or presenting like 3 of the 4 parts of an analogy and then asking students to think of the 4th part that would fill kind of like the rule of the relationship. And then once students are comfortable with that, then you can move on to student-directed tasks where students are taking on the bulk of the learning. So they're selecting the characteristics to compare in a comparison activity, or they are choosing the categories to sort things for classification. And it's really important to reflect and discuss with students as they're doing this work, because that's where you'll be able to see whether or not they're understanding, and as well as teacher feedback is also really important. So providing cues increases effectiveness, and it helps students kind of understand what they should expect. And so this can be done by presenting the important problem features that you're discussing in your lesson, providing students with labeled diagrams that they can fill out while you're teaching your lesson, or providing prompts. And so pointing out patterns and information can help students make sense of that information, like maybe explaining to them how something new they're learning is similar to something that they've already learned before. So this section, this is talking about how using these strategies, how we can use these strategies with today's learners. And the text mentions that like our curriculum is designed to be like a mile wide and an inch thick. Like we have so much content to cover and not always enough time to cover everything in depth. And one thing that really hit me, because I've done these analogies before, and I remember when I was younger not enjoying them so much like everyone else has mentioned. But as I was reading through the text and completing the presentation today, I was thinking about how those analogies really require higher level thinking from our students, and that doing them regularly helps students. If they can identify the relationships between information, then that means that they're understanding the information at a deeper level. And these strategies also help us move beyond students just identifying the right answers for learning, but understanding relationships and similarities and differences, and it helps them make sense of complex information. So there are different times where it might make sense to use these strategies, and this section was really helpful to me as I was planning like a lesson. So if you want to reference this slide as you're doing your lesson plans for the week, I think that would be really helpful. And so you first identify like what type of lesson you have. So if you're talking about items that are similar and different, then you could do a comparing strategy. If you're trying to place items into categories and explain why they belong there, then that is classifying. And you can use a chart or a circle diagram, and these were also mentioned already, so you can reference those. And then metaphors is talking about how things are similar at an abstract level, and analogies is looking at relationships between relationships or connecting old knowledge to new knowledge. It's also important to start with comparing and then move towards classifying, and also starting with, as part of that scaffolding, do teacher directed first and then move towards a more student directed approach. And along the way, make sure to it's important to provide feedback, naming processes when they're used. I think that was, I reflected a lot on that point, because I think sometimes, all the time as teachers, we may be citing these similarities and differences or classifying things, but not always explicitly stating that we're using a thinking process. and then providing opportunities for students to reflect and discuss the thought processes behind how they may have compared and contrast things or categorized things. The learning theories that I felt connected to these strategies, there were two of them that I felt fit really well. And so the first one was information processing theory. And this is because students, as they are identifying similarities and differences, it helps them to make sense of information, as well as compare new information to existing information or knowledge that they might already have. And using these strategies to help make sense of information and build upon the knowledge that they already have increases their retrieval and understanding of that information. And it also connects to constructivism, as students are making sense of new information based on prior knowledge and experiences. And just this whole idea of scaffolding was pretty heavy in this text, in this chapter. So starting with explicit instruction and then moving towards teacher-directed learning and then to student-directed learning. And I think that's the last slide. Are there any questions from anyone? Okay.
That was a great job. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments for them or for me or anything else? I agree. Nice work, everyone. If you didn't grab the link from the chat, go ahead and grab that. And you guys are out of class way early tonight, which I'm sure is happy for you. Okay, then. Have a good night. And if any of you need any help or have any questions, then I'll see you tomorrow night at open office hours at 8 o'clock. If you have any questions there, or just let me know. And we can have an individual meeting time. Otherwise, have a great night.
Good.
Thank you.
No, thank you guys. This is a good, you guys do such a nice job.